welcome to a new episode of The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives, advancing the conversation on multilateralism. Today's conversation is going to be all about branding, and here to tell us more is our guest today, Stefan Tschauko. Stefan has taught at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and at the Harvard Summer School on strategic communications in international organizations, and his research focuses on branding and brand management in international organizations with a strong focus on the UN system. So thank you for joining us today, Stefan. Would you like to introduce yourself to our audience and perhaps say a little bit more about how you became interested in branding in the UN in the first place?
Thank you, Amy, for having me for this podcast. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm excited to share a few things about this research that I've been doing for more than a decade by now. But some of the things, when I tell people that I'm studying branding at the United Nations, many people find that very confusing. They're curious. So maybe I want to share a few things, how I became interested in that topic. And so a bit over a decade ago, I used to work in a branding company. I had worked at this company for 5 years. That's in Vienna. And at some point of time, I wanted to do something different as part of my career. And I realized, maybe I'll study something new. I'll pursue a degree in management. That was the idea at the time. And this degree program that I wanted to pursue had collaborations with potential companies where people could do internships. And they also had collaborations with what they called 4 NGOs. And I looked closer at these NGOs, and one of those NGOs was a weirdly sounding organization with the name of UN Alliance of Civilizations. Now, I was immediately attracted to this particular organization because it had such a grand name, Alliance of Civilizations, and I had never heard of it. By the pure name of it, I thought these folks must be saving the planet single-handedly. And I found it curious that I had never heard about them, and I wanted to do my internship at this particular organization. So I tried to find out what this organization does and how it relates to the United Nations, because I also at that point of time became interested in the United Nations. So I go to the website of this UNAOC and I go to the website of the United Nations, and I'm trying to really find out, well, first of all, how are these two organizations related, the UN and the UNAOC, the Alliance of Civilizations, and I really struggled finding out whether or not they're actually part of the UN, which was so important for me at the time. And I also, at this moment, tried to understand more about the United Nations. And I also struggled with that because I had no background in international relations. And so I was confused, basically. And so I was hoping to get rid of my confusion about the UN system. By the way, I had never heard of the UN system, like many people outside of the UN system. I had never heard of the UN system. And when I discovered the term, I thought, oh, wow, there's a document called the UN System Chart. This must solve all my problems. And so I opened that UN System Chart. And what I see at the time is a hugely complex system. I was more confused than before. But in this moment of seeing this complex system, I also had to think of one of the statements by the founder of the company that I worked at the time, who used to say, branding is a tool to reduce complexity. And so this was the trigger moment, so to speak, when I became interested in looking at the United Nations and the United Nations system through the lens of branding. Another example why I chose to look at the UN system from the perspective of branding, because obviously there's many organizations part of the UN system. They all have different names. For example, the World Health Organization, WHO, or the International Labour Organization, ILO, and all of those organizations also have logos. And both names and logos are something that we deal with in branding. And so I looked at this UN system from the perspective of branding, and I realized this is fascinating from a branding point of view, because apparently all these organizations are part of the one family of this UN system, but you wouldn't notice if you looked at one of them only. If someone looked at the ILO's name and logo, you may not notice or realize that this is part of the UN, because there is no United Nations in the name. And it's not always clear if the logo is actually related to the UN's logo. There are other examples where we can see that relationship clearer, but at first sight, I found that very confusing and interesting, and I became interested in studying that in more depth. And that was roughly a bit more than 10 years ago. What happened then, to cut a long story short here, I did pursue an internship at this United Nations Alliance of Civilization here in New York. I got in touch with the Department of Public Information, which is now called the Department of Global Communications at the UN Secretariat. I did some research with them on their social media workflow. And then I realized that I've really become interested in international relations and in international organizations. And I wanted to pick up that idea of branding in international organizations. I looked for a bunch of schools where one could study that. And I found the school where I eventually went to, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston, part of Tufts University. They had a program where you can both study international organizations and communications and marketing. And I had two wonderful advisors. One had worked at the UN for many years. The other one is a marketing professor. And they became my primary advisory team, so to speak. In the beginning of this research, I ended up spending 9 years in total. They pursued a master's degree at this school and then eventually also as part of this PhD. That was my journey that led me to study branding at the UN. And of course, by now, I know some of the answers why some of these names of these UN organizations don't have the UN in their name and why the logos are different. But at the time, I didn't know. And I became curious exploring why that is the case and what are some of the implications of that. And in general, I just then pursue this research, trying to find out what is branding in international organizations and why does it matter? These were the two overarching research questions that I then pursued as part of my PhD.
Well, thank you for that. It sounds like it's been a fascinating journey for you. So let's start with those big questions that you set out to answer. Now, after all this research, what would you say branding is in the context of the UN and how is it different from corporate branding?
That's a great question, Amy. And I'd like to remind us here while we're speaking that branding is a very ambiguous word and concept, just like the word brand. If you ask a person on the street, or what I did, ask interviewees within the UN system, what is branding and what is brand in general or at the UN, you get a range of different answers. And maybe I can just bring in one quote that I really like to illustrate that. And one of my interviewees said, and then there's the word branding. I know what it is in general terms. It's like jazz. I know when I'm listening to jazz, but if you ask me to define what jazz is, I don't know. Branding, it's a little bit the same thing. I know what you're referring to, but you could be referring to different things. I really like that quote because it captures that ambiguousness of branding concepts. And as a consequence, I think it's difficult to have a structured conversation around branding topics because we could be talking about two different things. My first research question then aimed at resolving this ambiguousness and being very specific. These are the many things that could be part of branding that are either a synonym for branding or that are part of branding and brand management. That was my first attempt before we can have a conversation about why it matters. And as part of this first question, I came up with a framework. It's a visual framework, and I call it the IO Branding Universe, the International Organization's Branding Universe. And I call it universe because it's supposed to capture everything that is part of branding, the different components and the relationships between these components. And I'm having in front of me a visual representation of that because I wanted to be very specific. So this visual representation consists of many names and concepts that are all part of this. And what I'll try to do now is paint a picture for the listener so they can imagine what this looks like without actually seeing it. So the branding universe basically describes three main meanings of branding. And so listeners can imagine a rectangle in front of them. And in this rectangle, there are three columns, three pillars from left to right, pillar 1, pillar 2, pillar 3. And each of these pillars, each of these columns represents one of the main meanings of branding and brand. And I'll briefly explain what those meanings are, because if we have talked about these main meanings, then we know, oh, wow, these are all the things that are part of branding. Okay. I call the first pillar on the most left-hand side of this, I call it branding manifestations. Let's have a look at what's inside this pillar. These are all the things that the organization do that traditionally have to do with branding, almost intuitively. For example, the logos of an organization. Organizations create logos. And most people know the UN logo, for example, or the UNICEF logo. Slogans that organizations use, for example, for every child, for UNICEF, or sharing humanity, for UNESCO, or the triple planetary crisis for the UN Environment Program. As part of these branding manifestations, we also have values. Organizations often define values for themselves, for their employees. That is part of branding. Vision and mission statement. That's another component of these branding manifestations. Branding is often also associated with graphic design. And a particular component of graphic design that's part of branding is what we call the visual identity. So certain guidelines, how visual products of the organization are supposed to look like. The font that publications and websites use, the colors, certain grids that are being maintained in a publication, etc., etc. So this is a bunch of concepts that I put in a box in a major category, which I call branding manifestations. That was the first major meaning. Part of those branding manifestations are, of course, also things like branding manuals. You may not believe it, but international organizations, part of the UN, have brand manuals and they have visual identity manuals. And they describe many of these things that we've just talked about. Now let's focus our attention to the last pillar, to the third one. Let's leave out the one in the middle, because this last pillar on the right-hand side of this picture that we're drawing captures another intuitive meaning of brand and branding. Many people, if you ask them, so what is your brand? Or what is this particular organization's brand? What they mean is actually that organization's or person's image or reputation. And I capture this group of meanings in this pillar, which I call ideas. We have a number of different ideas about organizations that we could all call this organization's brand. And I'll give you a few examples what those ideas may be. First of all, we need to be aware of the existence of that particular organization. That is key. Otherwise, it's very difficult to create any other perceptions about that organization. Then other ideas that are related and important for international organizations are the legitimacy, authority, trust, reputation, credibility. These are some of the ideas that matter for international organizations. These are some overarching ideas, very general ideas, but some very specific ideas also matter. For example, what type of work is that organization actually doing? Are they successful or are they inefficient? How do they work? Are they very collaborative or do they work in silos? These are all different ideas that informants shared with me that matter for these organizations and that have to do with branding. So these are these different ideas that people have about the international organization that matter, and that these ideas are a second meaning of branding. I'd like to add one more type of idea, and that is, according to the data and my analysis and the model that I propose here, it is in international organizations not only about the ideas that we have about international organizations themselves, but also about the issues that they work on. So that has come up repeatedly, that it's not only in branding about creating a wonderful perception about a particular international organization, how wonderful we are, basically some kind of self-promotion. It is rather about promoting the ideas that the particular organization is all about and is trying to advance, such as children's rights, such as protecting the environment, such as plastic pollution, etc., etc., etc. So that's a separate type of ideas that's not related to the organization, but rather to the issues that the organization is concerned about, and that's also part of branding. So now we have these two pillars already, two main meanings of brand and branding. Branding manifestations on the left-hand side of our picture, ideas on the right-hand side of our picture. And now what is in the middle? In the middle is a pillar that I call touchpoints. And touchpoints is any kind of interaction where a stakeholder, first of all, interacts with the organization. So stakeholders could be a member of the general public, it could be a member state representative, it could be a partner, it could be an NGO, it could be a potential donor. All these are stakeholders the way I see them. Anyone who interacts with the organization. And they interact with the organization at touchpoints. What are some of these touchpoints that matter for branding? Well, someone in my interview said, well, our leader is part of the brand. I am part of the brand. I, as a staff member, am part of the brand. And so that quote or that statement actually triggered me to make this component here, touchpoints, a critical component of the model. And when we think of touchpoints, we can come up with a bunch of other touchpoints that matter for IOs, such as websites, such as social media channels, such as merchandise, maybe even the UN headquarters, maybe in the field, goods, UNICEF backpacks are maybe a good example, right? These are also touchpoints. Each of these touchpoints has a different capacity of creating ideas, but the way I define touchpoints is that it is at these touchpoints, when stakeholders interact with the organization through touchpoints, that is when we create ideas about the organization. Different ideas at different touchpoints, but at all these touchpoints, we create ideas.
You really got me hooked already when you just talked about jazz and branding. And you've talked about your 3 elements that you have distilled and found within the system that you've built up. So tell us a bit more about how these 3 different components relate to each other.
I alluded already to one relationship. So we have these 3 pillars from the left to right, and I focused on the touch points create ideas. That is one of the key relationships. When stakeholders interact with any touch point, they create ideas about the organization that they associate with that touch point. Maybe I can make a footnote here, because when we think about branding and brand, often we think about the logo. And the logo, one of the functions of the logo is associating a particular touch point with that organization. When I read a report about the United Nations and it has the UN logo on it, a bunch of things happen in my head. I trust that report. I actually feel attracted to that report. That's me personally, because I have positive ideas already in my head about the United Nations. And when I see a UN report based on the name and the logo, I trust it. So here, the logo, the association, the affiliation of that touch point with the UN attracts me to the touch point. And when I interact with that touch point, when I read that particular report, for example, then I create all kinds of ideas about the UN. In a report that I may be reading, maybe it's the annual report, the report of the Secretary General about the organization, I may develop ideas about the great success stories of the organization in the past year. I may be reading about some of the challenges that the UN tries to address. The kinds of ideas really depend on what kind of touch point I'm exposed to. If I go to the website that is geared to a different audience, a potential reader of the website develops other ideas. So this is the role of touchpoints, creating ideas about the organization itself and about the issues. This is the first relationship. And the second relationship is then we could ask, how exactly do these touchpoints create these ideas? What is it at these touchpoints that create ideas? And this is how I propose to think about it. This is very conceptual almost, so I don't want to overdo it with my analysis, but I feel that it's the branding manifestations on the left-hand side pillar that shape the touch points, and the touch points then shape these ideas. So for example, if I'm reading a report, a piece of paper that I'm reading doesn't generate any ideas. But the moment I put a UN logo on it, I already have an idea. Okay, so this is a UN report. If the report is of high quality, I may think of the organization of producing high quality work. If it's well written, I may think these people are really professionals, etc., etc. So there's a bunch of different branding manifestations that I could feel at these touch points and experience at these touch points that then create the ideas. Let's assume the UN has a bunch of values defined for its staff members, and staff members live up to that. One of those values could be openness. And if you were to live up to that, you would be impersonating that openness. And through your openness that's defined as a value in these branding manifestations, I would feel and perceive the organization as being very open and dynamic and flexible, and many other things that you could be impersonating, so to speak.
Well, I would certainly hope that the Library and Archives is a welcoming and open place for our client. You also link all of this with performance of the international organizations. Tell us a little bit more about that.
This question now goes to the second research question that I posed myself and wanted to find out, because after really identifying everything that is part of branding, all these 3 pillars and the branding universe that we just talked about, the question, of course, arises, why does this all matter? And it's interesting that intuitively, many people think that it does matter. And so maybe I can bring in a quote that shows that it matters, even before we define how it matters. But one of my interviewees mentioned, everyone knows that brand is absolutely essential, whether you are a for-profit company or an organization like the United Nations, but to prove that worth is really difficult. So there seems to be an understanding that brand matters, but we don't yet know how exactly it matters. Having this branding universe specified allows us now to establish why brand and branding matters. The major relationship here is the ideas that people have. The way I phrased my question, I want to take a step back before I elaborate on that, but I phrased the question as, how does branding relate to the performance of international organizations? And when I used the word performance, I didn't define that. I wanted to understand, out of the different ways that people may define performance within the United Nations, which of these parts is related to branding. So I didn't go in this research and had a fixed idea about what performance is. It was very all-encompassing, and I tried to find out which of these performance dimensions has any relationship with branding. So that's what I did, and sometimes when I use the word performance, I realized people thought of staff performance. That is already a very specific performance dimension. I thought of it as broader, and maybe staff performance is part of that, but much broader. A word that's being used and a concept being used within the United Nations is impact. So impact of the organization would then also be part of that performance. Now, the question is, how does branding relate to performance, including impact? And the main relationship is really the ideas. And so let me give you perhaps a few examples. If I, as a donor, think of a particular organization, let's say UNICEF, as a very efficient organization that cares about an issue, children, that I as a donor also care about, then I may be inclined to provide funding to that organization. So here we have a first performance dimension, funding, fundraising, if you wish. Another example, if I'm a recent graduate in some STEM field, some science field, and I'm looking for a job, and I have this idea in my head that UNESCO also employs scientists, then I may be applying for a job there. So recruiting would be another performance dimension. Staff is another performance dimension. Let's say I'm an NGO or I'm heading an NGO and I'd like to work with the UN, but I'm not sure. Are they collaborative? Are they not? Are they open to new ideas? Are they not? Are they easy or difficult to work with? Let's assume I have all these positive versions of these ideas, then I may want to engage with partnerships with the UN. I'm not being held back by thinking, oh, this is so bureaucratic and there's all these civil servants who are maybe only doing 9 to 5. I'm stating some stereotypes that people may have. If I were to have these stereotypical ideas about civil servants at the UN, I may not want to engage in a partnership. But if I have experienced the UN and other IOs of the UN system as collaborative, as dynamic, and as really trying to achieve something and make a difference in people's life, then I may want to work with the UN and I may want to engage in partnerships. So partnerships is another one of those performance dimensions. All of these performance dimensions that we so far talked about, we could group into what sometimes people may call capacity of the organization. Any organization needs staff members, any organization needs funding, and many organizations can only do their work when they're partnering with someone else. So this is a bunch of performance dimensions that I have identified and that all relate to branding via these ideas. There's a few other performance dimensions which I'd like to briefly mention, which have more to do with the mandate and the impact of the organization. For example, many UN organizations' job is also to create awareness for particular issues. For example, UNEP is also in charge of creating awareness among various stakeholders about certain environmental issues. Currently, maybe plastic pollution or biodiversity. So there's a bunch of different issue areas that international organizations need to raise awareness about. And so we talked earlier on about that part of branding is also creating ideas about these issues. So here's the relationship again. If I, as a stakeholder, have a particular idea about an issue, then I already have achieved a performance dimension that is important for this organization because my awareness is raised. If I happen to be a multiplier or news media outlet, I'm an editor in the New York Times, and I have all these wonderful ideas, first of all, about these issues and also about the United Nations and other UN or system organizations, well, then I may take a press release very serious, and I may take a report that's released by the United Nations very serious, and I may contribute to agenda setting because I'm including certain topics in my reporting in any news media outlet that I'm in charge of. Agenda setting is another one of those performance dimensions that matters. And I want to bring in one last performance dimension that's key, and that is, I call it stakeholder action. So stakeholders take action. Because as many people familiar with the UN system know, the UN and the IOs, part of the UN system, they can't solve all the problems that they're in charge of themselves. They rely on the actions by a number of different stakeholders, perhaps most notably the member state representative, to implement certain domestic legislation and contribute to advancing these issues. For example, signing a treaty on plastic pollution. And so for member states, or for example, just being part of an organization, we experience now that some countries are leaving certain UN system organizations. And in the terms of this model, maybe they are leaving this organization because they have certain ideas about these organizations, which they think they don't want to support. So they have ideas about these organizations. WHO may be a current example. And they want to leave these organizations because they don't believe in the good work of the WHO. So member states need to take certain action, and one of those actions is staying within these organizations, signing up for treaties, implementing domestic legislations. That's maybe a bunch of actions that member state representatives can take. Another stakeholder are obviously the general public. In order to address climate change and pollution, everyone can play a part. And if the UN were to tell me about, Stefan, this is what you should be doing, and if I happen to have positive ideas about the UN, then I may believe that, whatever the UN is telling me. If I happen to have not positive ideas, and if I don't think that the UN is a credible organization, then I may also not pay attention to the advice they are giving me, for example. So this is then how branding relates to the performance of the organization. It is because certain stakeholders have certain ideas about the organization or one of its issue areas, and these ideas then make stakeholders take certain actions. And these actions then lead to having qualified staff, having funding, engaging in partnerships with the organization. It also leads to raised awareness among these stakeholders, to global agenda setting, and to certain stakeholder actions that are required for the advancing of the various issues that IOs are in charge of.
And so we really see why this matters so much. So you kind of encapsulated some of your findings by making what I saw as a really powerful statement around your model, saying that branding in IOs means advancing humankind through the power of ideas. It really is so powerful to say it like that. What I'm really curious about in your model is the role of attraction that you place between the different elements, your 3 columns that you described earlier. Would you tell us a bit more about the function that attraction plays, and give us an example of where this kind of attraction resulted in the advancement?
I came up with this. At some point of time, I needed to simplify the model because I've been sharing a bunch of different ideas and concepts that are part of this huge IO branding universe. And it becomes fascinating and very specific and wonderful to think about it and talk about it. But if you're trying to give someone a top level, 1 paragraph idea about what this is all about and why it matters, I needed to simplify it. And as I took a step back from the various components and the various relationships of this IO branding universe and how it relates to performance, I realized that many of these branding activities and the touch points and the ideas that there's 2 types of attraction involved. And the first type of attraction is that touch points, the job of touch points, simplified on a very generalized level, the job of touch points is to attract stakeholders to that touch point. Because only if a stakeholder is attracted to a touch point, then they pay attention to that touch point, they listen or they read or they engage with that touch point. And when they do that, then they develop ideas. So that's why it's so important that touch points are attractive or attract stakeholders. Let's pick a few examples. A website. Visual design is one of those secret components, if you wish, of making a particular touch point attractive. this visual design is also relevant for publications. I think it's also relevant for business cards. These are minor things. I don't want to say that these are the most important things, but these are things that are part of branding. I noticed that when I engaged with UN staff members throughout the years, people have all kinds of different email signatures. And it seems to be a minor thing, but if one were to engage with many UN system staff members and always has a different signature, one could develop the idea that this seems to be very unorganized. So here's how the touchpoint and a particular component of the touchpoint would be the email in this case, the branding component, the branding manifestation there would be the email signature. And the differences in email signatures could create an idea that doesn't seem to be very professional. We probably don't want to have that idea in people's heads. We want to project also professionalism. Another interesting element, I think, for touchpoint attractiveness is whether or not it is affiliated with the UN or any of the other IOs. For example, repeatedly, in interviews mentioned that the UN has this pulling power. For many people, at least, when something has the seal of the United Nations, people are drawn to it. Sometimes people abuse this also, which is why the legal departments of these organizations also deal with making sure that only certain partners and basically only people within the organization are using the emblem and the logo of the UN and other IOs, because the UN itself has that pulling power. So that's another way of attraction. I'll mention one more because it came up repeatedly. The UN has an effort of multilateralism. So many of the websites and the print products are created in many languages. And I think that is one of those secret ingredients that could create attraction, because if I am not capable of speaking one of the 6 official UN languages, or if I'm only able to speak one of them but not the other, then I may struggle to actually read and consume and be attracted to any of the UN touchpoints. So I think in that sense, this multilingualism approach and initiative is a good one to increase attractiveness of any kind of UN websites and products for people all around the world.
You've given us some good ideas there. Let's make this even more practical then, putting your model into action. So if we had an idea about an impact we wanted to have, how can we use your model to do that? And can we use your model to evaluate as well?
That's a great question, Amy. And I'd like to answer maybe the second question first, because you asked, how can that model be used to evaluate? In the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the fact that brand and branding are two very ambiguous concepts. And so if someone were to say within the UN, we really have to work on our branding, the question may arise, well, what exactly should I or should we do? And what I proposed with this model is now a way of being much more specific. Do we have a problem with any of our branding manifestations? For example, do we have too many logos? Is our logo not representative of the work that we're doing? Do we have a vision and mission statement? Are our employees, do they have certain values? Are they aware of certain values that we would like to project because our employees are touchpoints? So that is one way of looking at it. We can be very specific. Okay, do we have a problem, or would we like to evaluate branding manifestations? Or are we not happy with our touchpoints? Do we have too many websites? Do the websites that we have create the correct ideas? What kind of ideas do they create, et cetera, et cetera? And lastly, and maybe that is, again, the most important way of using that model and the way of thinking for evaluation is, and I think that's done anyway, is what kind of ideas do people have about the UN and UN system organizations compared to which ideas should they have? And that is done, of course, in opinion polls. And this is just highlighting the importance of ideas again. So the model provides a way of being very specific in evaluating any of these components. And it probably makes sense to start evaluating the ideas, because those have, according to the model, the most direct relationship with performance. There's a few other relationships, but the ideas are really the key thing. And that's why it's also captured in that slogan that I created for my model. So that is to answer your second question, how can we use that for evaluation? Now I want to go to your first question, how exactly can we use it? How can we put this in practice? I want to invoke again our picture that we have with these three columns of the branding universe. On the left-hand side, we have the branding manifestations. The branding manifestations shape touchpoints, the second pillar in the middle. And the touchpoints shape ideas, so the third pillar on the right-hand side. And then we talked about the performance, and I proposed to just think of performance as a fourth pillar, sitting right next to the other three pillars. And then what I proposed is that ideas shape performance. I'm proposing a causality here. Branding manifestations shape touchpoints, touchpoints shape ideas, and ideas lead to certain performance dimensions. Now, how can we put this in practice? I propose to reverse engineer performance. So I suggested we're looking at performance dimensions first. What would we like to work on? You suggested, okay, how can we have more impact? So I'm now looking at the performance dimensions that have more to do with impact rather than the capacity. So let's say, for example, we would like to raise awareness around a particular topic. The first question is, okay, among which stakeholders do we need to raise awareness? Then we can ask ourselves the question, this particular stakeholder group, let's just say the general public in Austria. We want to raise awareness around plastic pollution in Austria. Which touch points do stakeholders of the general public engage with? When we know that, we can ask the question, how do we need to shape these touch points so that eventually stakeholders create ideas about plastic pollution that we want them to have? Let's say avoid plastic pollution generally when shopping. We reverse engineer this by looking at the performance dimension first. We ask ourselves, which stakeholder needs to take a certain action? Then we ask, okay, what kind of ideas do they need to have in order to take that action? Then we ask, at which touch points do they create these ideas? And when we know that, we can wonder, how do we shape these touch points using our many different branding manifestations so that they hopefully create eventually the ideas we want them to have so they take a certain action? So this is how the model goes from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, how branding manifestations shape touchpoints shape ideas lead to certain actions that contribute to the performance or impact or the capacity of the organization. And we can just reverse engineer this by going back. That's simplified. Obviously, we need to make it simple for now, but I think it would certainly be an interesting research effort in then untangling this for the many different stakeholders and the many different touchpoints that are out there. That's certainly something I'd like to pursue in the future.
Certainly sounds a great idea to test. Stefan, tell us more about what you think we need to be doing more of.
I want to be very careful here because the many people that I spoke with, they're all experts in their fields. So some of the things that I may be sharing now may well be established in certain people's heads and they know all this. So I don't want to claim that I have the solutions to all the problems or the challenges that any UN organization may have with their branding. In fact, I think many are quite obviously doing a great job. What I'm proposing is just what can we do based on this model, on this grand overview of all the things that are part of branding. The two things that are most important are the ideas and the touch points. And I think one of the challenges that UN organizations have is that many people develop ideas based on touch points such as news media. Most people probably never go to the UN website. Most people are not following the social media channels of the UN, of the various UN organizations, though we have to admit that many of these social media channels have a huge following. And many people, in particular maybe in Western countries, learn about the UN and the UN system organizations through news media or maybe through their own bubbles on social media, but probably don't go to UN-controlled touchpoints. And that's a challenge because media reporting may be positive or negative. It depends on the editor. It depends on the journalist. It depends on the political orientation of the particular news media outlet. So in that sense, I think it is absolutely crucial to pay attention to every single touch point that the UN can control. Because if any member of the general public or any stakeholder happens to come across a UN system controlled touch point, this is the chance to really grab them and maybe change some of the perceptions that they may have about the UN, which may be negatively tainted by what they have read before on news media. So this is really almost like a one-off chance. Now here's our moment. Someone made the effort of going to the UN website or following one of the social media, and now we really want to grab them. Some of these websites and social media channels are wonderful examples, and I want to bring in one example. I keep remembering the ILO social media post. ILO created weekends. It's one of those infographics and that I keep bringing up because I personally didn't know this. And I'm obviously very grateful for weekends. So automatically I have this positive association with ILO. So touchpoints are increasingly important. And I would like to bring in maybe one example, another touchpoint that I like to bring up because it's just a huge opportunity to change people's minds about the UN. And these are the tours. Now, guided visitor tours, not many people do that. Most of the people may not make it to New York or to Geneva in their lives. So it's only a fraction of the population, obviously, that can do that. But for those who do, I think a UN visitor tour should be a wow experience. And I've taken these tours and I think they're very informative and I really enjoy them and I learn a lot about them. But I also know a few things about the UN already, so I can put things into context. But if I came to the UN as a visitor and I don't know much about the UN, I think there's an opportunity to make people leave with a wow experience. And I'm dreaming here a little bit because I'm not sure what is possible in terms of security and funding, et cetera, et cetera. But for example, if here in New York, the visitor tour included a component that is set where visitors are being shown basically in New York, the headquarters here, the secretariat has on the 4th floor facing the East River, so east of Manhattan. And it is a gorgeous view. Most people may never see that, but if that was included in the UN visitor tour, that would automatically create such a wow moment. It has nothing to do with the UN, obviously. In this case, it just so happens that the UN has a location there, but it would create a wow moment, a positive memory. And then people who take the tour could go outside and just tell other friends, hey, if you ever happen to be in New York, you definitely have to go to the UN tour just because of the view. It's a hook. It's a touch point. It's attractive. And it leaves the visitor, in this case, with a positive interaction moment. So that's one of these touch points. And I think paying attention to touch points is very key and finding ways of making more touch points.
I love your ideas of wow moments. So, Stefan, final thoughts.
Final thoughts. I think these touch points, paying attention to touch points and the ideas that they can create is critical. I think it's also critical to consider a range of stakeholders. What I hear in interviews is often that member states are in the foreground. I think that the various communication departments across the UN system also pay attention to other stakeholders, but I'm not sure if that is part of everyone's thinking that the general public is also important as a stakeholder whose ideas we need to shape, because eventually they hold their politicians responsible for how the tax money is spent. And if the general public likes the UN and these organizations, then it's easier for politicians to give money to. So that's why the general public's ideas about the UN and other IOs is important. Touch points such as employees are important. We talked about you, Amy, as being one of the touch points that shaped my ideas about the UN. There's so many other people that I spoke with at the UN and IOs that have shaped my positive ideas about these IOs. So if every staff member had this idea in their heads that I have the opportunity every day when I'm interacting with people outside of the UN to create positive ideas about the UN, I think that would also go a long way, making staff members aware of the fact you are what we call in branding, a brand ambassador. And whether or not we use that word doesn't matter, but every staff member has the opportunity to, in daily interactions, shape other people's ideas about the UN. So this is one of the key takeaways from the model, thinking about ideas and thinking about the touch points where these ideas are created and potentially can be created, and increasing these touch point moments and wow moments, I think, are key for, in particular, the general public that care less about in the initial moment about any facts and figures, but just want to have a good feeling. And so speaking about these touch points, maybe this is the moment to also thank you, Amy, for providing this opportunity. I'd also like to thank my advisors who have been part of this journey. Michael Möller is one of my touch points, the former head of the UN in Geneva. My two advisors at the Fletcher School, Professor Ian Johnston and Bernard Simonin, who have been part of this journey. And then speaking of touch points, let's recall for a second what branding means. The way I propose it, branding in international organizations of the UN system means advancing humankind through the power of ideas. And so I want to thank the people who gave me these different ideas that I've just shared with you in this conversation the many different stakeholders and UN staff members and member states representatives who have shared with me their wisdom, which is the foundation for everything we've talked about. So thank you to all of you for spending time and sharing wisdom with me about what you think about branding at the UN.
Well, thank you. I've certainly learned quite a lot through this encounter. I'd like to thank you, Stefan Tschauko. Thanks so much for being with us and helping us focus on branding.
Thank you, Amy.